Hi everyone from London, and thanks for tuning into Calling International Talks. We hope that with these interviews you will find inspiration, ideas, and things to look forward to. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us with more questions, thoughts, and your experiences at this time and the live chat in the YouTube. So my enormous pleasure to welcome Arthur Mamou-Mani. Welcome, Arthur.
Hello.
Hello.
Merhaba.
Wow.
Teşekkürler.
How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. I'm feeling great. I'm just out of 3 weeks of COVID, so I'm so happy I went through it. So I'm especially happy and lucky.
Because I know that your last trip was Barcelona, then you.
Yeah, that's the last time I traveled. I was at the YAC, the school in Barcelona, to do a crit about Earth 3D printing, which was really, really amazing. Like, I think there's not that many schools that thinks of technology with sustainability, and they really think about it. And so I loved it. Unfortunately, I came back and that was the confinement. So
yeah, and maybe a little bit, could you just introduce yourself, who you are, where you are, what's your background?
Oh, did I lose you for a sec? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I'm Arthur Mamou-Mani. I'm an architect, and I'm also a teacher at the University of Westminster. And I also own a fab lab here in London on Hackney Road called the FabPub. That's me.
Maybe it's cool that you can mention your parents a bit, because that I know that they created a book called Life in Green. Like,
oh wow.
Oh yeah, I saw it. And how are you? Their effect on you? Maybe you just a little bit.
Yeah, I mean it's a very good research. They wrote a couple of books, and one together, Life in Green, where they were trying to say how the economy could work hand in hand with the ecology. Because I think sometimes we divide the two. We say there cannot be a growth without pollution, or there cannot be capitalism without ethics. And so the whole work of my parents was about trying to merge both. And so they say that it all relies on us, not on the government. So it all relies on us having an ethic and trying to bring this to your own companies, to your own world. So it's very empowering, I think, for everyone to think this way, to think that you can have an impact on society, rather than blaming and saying, the system, it's everyone else's fault, and so that was a great education in that sense.
And actually, coming back to these extraordinary days, we are thinking much more these ethical issues, as well as maybe a lot of things happening. So as both work and social life fold into the home, and the line between, I believe that the domesticity and the public life has all disappeared completely. But how are you organizing your day? I know that you are getting much more jobs and doing a lot of things.
Well, I mean, we just have to reshuffle everything. Obviously, the whole team works from home. We're about 10 people that have Slack, the platform. And we've been lucky because I think because our work is very digital, and it's very sort of adaptable, because we're quite multidisciplinary. We helped, for example, the NHS for building like masks on our 3D printer. And people have donated. We didn't ask, and people just gave. And often it's like this with our work. It's we suggest a project, and people buy into it and like it and help us. And I think that's a really nice way to kind of just kind of test what's useful for people, rather than wait for a client to have an idea. And it makes us quite active in that sense.
Yeah, but also we are kind of a slowdown, right? Like we are adapting a new altered sense of time, because like the time perception has changed a lot. And so how is your relation to this day?
I mean, I personally enjoy confinement. I find that we are in our homes, with our loved ones, and we can kind of focus. There's a sense of calm. Maybe that's because I don't have any kids, but it might be different for other people. But I love it because I can read. I have peace and quiet. Obviously I miss the team a lot, and I think that there is a real advantage in having a physical office to kind of have this informal meeting together. but I do like this one-on-one, and I get to meet more people, I think, virtually than I did when I had to travel. And in that sense, I've strangely been more connecting with more people. It's strange, yeah.
Yeah, because it's not easy to meet. Like we are also like easily meet, but I really want to come to your FabPub.
Well, I do miss the physical object. I think that's the one thing that we can't have here, which is, and that's why we have a permanence. Like people have been going to the office to test and model and 3D print and laser cut, and then they send pictures. And so, and that's really the one aspect that cannot exist in confinement is making. Yeah.
And also a lot of like do-it-yourself project, because it's also changed its meaning a lot nowadays.
Yeah. A lot of projects are changing. Like we were meant to build something at Burning Man this summer, and it obviously they changed. Burning Man is now a virtual thing, and so we had to kind of made a call for video games, and it was really interesting. The answer. I mean, I received 20, 30 requests for collaborations. Yeah, so that was really exciting.
Yeah, it's only I think 2 days that you had this.
I know.
Yeah.
It's amazing. I think people are really excited because, you know, like we all want to enjoy and go outside and have the activities we used to have, but because we're confined, you can't do it legally, right? So people are seeking for alternative, and you know, my wife, she bought a Nintendo Switch, right? And she spends her day on Zelda. She wouldn't be happy if I said that. Which doesn't work, but you know, it makes me think like, wow, there is this amazing world of video games, but we don't use it necessarily to connect us. I mean, my nephew does, you know, he plays video games, multiplayer, Fortnite and all that. But as architects, we don't think of this as a way to have site visits or multiplayer action that is related to what we do in a festival or. And you know, yesterday I met a developer in the alt space, and we had a site visit of Catharsis because we're starting to place the amphitheater in a virtual gaming environment, and it was amazing. Like we were in the site, and we were testing like proper site visit, but with avatars. And I was just like, oh my goodness, why didn't I do this before? Like meet my client in the virtual world. Like it's amazing how much it opens up possibilities. And I hope we're all open-minded to these changes.
I think this kind of, how can I say, the protection about like the physical environment opens your mind and you see differently in a it's always there. Like we always know this Oculus and to using it in a virtual way, but it's a kind of different. But can you tell us about a bit this fractal amphitheater that you are, I think the Burning Man turns into a virtual event now, and you have this virtual place. Maybe I will also open the pictures as well.
Yeah, so Catharsis was an idea to do a new kind of project at Burning Man because we did the temple called Galaxia last year, 2 years ago actually. Yeah. And you know, it was a very spiritual space where people put a lot of offerings, and it was a very serious place where people spoke about death and things that they can't quite do in a normal temple because they're not religious, but this was a secular temple. And so a lot of people interacted no matter where they came from. And there were all kinds of things like people putting like a wedding dress and they wanted to let go of their wedding and so on. Or, you know, it all kinds of really emotional things. You know, someone put an old gun really, which I mean, honestly, every time I went there, I couldn't stop but explode in tears because it was pretty beautiful. And we burnt it at the end so that everyone could release all these things. So like you can see all the volunteers here. So we were about 120 volunteers building this without income really, but just we had to fundraise for the whole thing. So this is a big module that we put together, and this crane would pick the module and put it up. So it was a big modular project, and people would then write on these modules, and so that gives you a sense of the scale. There was a big sponge that people would put all kinds of emotional stuff on it, and there was these tiers, 3D printed tiers in the middle that went down and sort of represented that we all have that fragility and that it's okay not to be okay, you know. And I really enjoyed this project, but it was very, very heavy on the on the soul really. And so and also the act of burning it is something that I wanted to question. And then we also got married there, so that's handy.
Well,
and that's my mom, you know. So, you know, it was really beautiful because, you know, as well as any kind of temple, there is, you know, of course, we talk about death, we talk about birth, but also about any transition that is important in your life. And you know, when I proposed to Sandy, I designed a little 3D printed ring, and and so after when we got to build the temple, I was like, well, in all logic, as an architect, if we get to build a temple, maybe we can get married in there. And so it was a really beautiful event where we could celebrate together. And so it wasn't just about death, but also about joyful things, you know. But thinking about this and thinking that we can reinvent ritual, I thought, well, for the next one, so for catharsis, maybe we could, you know, rethink this act of burning. And we can think of something where we could instead establish the same dialogue with other cities. Because really, Burning Man has so many interesting principles, you know, 10 principles, radical self-reliance, gift economy, leave no trace. And there are lessons we can take from these principles into the, you know, other cities and the outside world. So with some friends and other kind of like-minded thinker, we're just like, well, why don't we do a project that we build a sort of amphitheater for all kinds of art, so a creative version of the temple, where people can place art, can kind of write things, and then we disassemble it, and then we place it somewhere else. And we were going to place it at the Somerset House next year.
Yeah,
and yeah, you can kind of see it here. And instead of putting it in the desert far away from the city of Burning Man, we were going to put it inside Black Rock City. Black Rock City is the city that's being built in a week. And it's a really interesting city. To be honest, it probably may be more interesting than the art, because it's got, if you're an architect, it's got all kinds of interesting initiatives, like the Hexayurt movement, which is an open source movement to create shelters, which is then used for refugee camps and stuff. You know, things like Solar City by Elon Musk was thought of in this space. And so I thought, well, if we put a piece of art in the city, then we can talk about these issues. And then if we get to disassemble it, we can talk about buildings that can disassemble themselves, which is something very dear to me. And you know, the idea of circular economy and so on. So this is the amphitheater. It's pretty big. That's my colleagues, I am, and Lucy holding the model to show how, you know, the system. It's based on a fractal, so it's like an amphitheater, but it's made of smaller amphitheaters, so different kinds of performing spaces and galleries in between, which allows you to place things and also decide to perform anywhere you want. And it really, at Burning Man, there's no spectators, so everyone is the performer. And so to have a really centralized system wouldn't make sense there. So that's why we sort of, it's a kind of inside out sort of, you know, spaces within spaces, so that you can explore different possibilities.
I think everyone is like waiting about the virtual one as well now.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, every day is a new. You can meet me on site on the alt space if you want.
I would love to. I always want to go to Burning Man, but maybe it's my first time.
Yeah, exactly. It's funny because you know, I went there to the virtual version and I'm like, wow, this kind of feels like the same thing, you know, and you kind of like, because it's a space that only exists, it exists only a week, right? Yeah. So most of the year it's in our brain. And only for a week, there's this one city that's always similar with the same shape and so on. But when I went there, I was like, wow, it's like an in-between space, in between my mind and reality. It's like kind of a weird in-between space. I love it. It was so interesting.
Yeah, sure. And it's also like this boundary between the kind of architect, gamers, fabricator, maker is blurring. As you say, the space is like blurring. So also, as you mentioned that you had like this digital fabrication lab like called FabPub, and how it works. Maybe it's good to know when the physical reality continues, how it works.
So it's basically a space in which people can come and make things. It's open to the public, and it's so we give them an induction, and then they can book online and really just use it on an hourly basis. The idea was a little bit like, I don't know, Zipcar, or, you know, things where you kind of you get used to the machine, and then after that you're on your own. And in that sense, it allowed us to empower people, to tell them you don't need us. Like, those machines are now simple enough that you don't necessarily need the expertise of someone always here. And so that was really nice because every day we have different amazing artists that come. Like we had some street artists like Stickman coming and wanting to do we're in East London, so we get all kinds of amazing Akiko Ban. She does like jewelry, beautiful jewelry. And so for me, it's like a space that doesn't, because I have an architectural studio where, it's kind of like the signature thing. So it's nice to have the yin to the yang, which is other people come and enrich us with their unique mindsets. For me, it was always a beautiful empowerment of the community. All these ideas, parametric design, digital fabrication, they're really about the others rather than me.
Yeah, it's perfect. But I was always quite fascinated about this, like Fab Labs, makerspaces. I also doing my research on these makerspaces as well. It's a kind of a new, not new, but it's changing also its meaning when the time, especially in nowadays, as we talked to earlier, it's also changing its meaning, because I always asking myself that, like, what are these giant, like the 3D printers are in there, but we are at home, so what's going to happen? But also, like, you are fabricating masks for the NHS, so a lot of things, like it's all about your mind, I believe.
Yeah, it's our mind. And also when we decide to speak about topics that people are very sensitive about, like, before the coronavirus was the sustainability issues. And then, the makers, they use often PLA, which is a polylactic acid, a bioplastic. And people didn't really necessarily know what's compostable, what's biodegradable, what's the carbon footprint, what's the toxicity for the air of normal plastic, and so on. And so it's interesting to kind of orient technology towards issues that matters to people. So we don't talk about technology just because technology is cool, but we talk about technology because it helps the world. And I think for me, that's the real mind shift we need to have. And that's why I really enjoyed the YAC presentation, for example, because I just feel like architects have a tendency to complexify things, to make things into crazy concepts that we don't need to. Like, it's, what we do is cool enough. I think the general public enjoy architecture when it speaks to their soul, when it speaks to the issues that matters to them. And so we don't need to add a layer. We don't need to add something that's even more complex, You were about to show something I did with Chris Brecht, which is an amazing architect from Austria. And I say this because he's one of the few really amazing architects nowadays that can connect with people. And there is a sense of naivety in the work. It can appear naive, but I actually think it's daring to be naive. It's actually courageous to be naive, because it speaks to the heart. It speaks to the inner child of people. And so I really enjoyed working with him, because we were trying to think of a solution for a place that's very controversial. Obviously Saudi Arabia, there was a lot of people saying, why do you work creative there if you believe in sustainability? And I said, well, if we're not going to change things, who's going to change things? And really we thought, well, okay, so they have sand, they have a lot of sand. So, and people use like printers to print with sand to cast objects in metal usually, There was a foundry not too far. And so we asked the people, like, well, can we print an object that can resist, child climbing it and so on? And so we're lucky enough to work with really interesting engineers, like the format. We did the Galaxia with them, and they're not too scared about taking risk like this. And so we were like, okay, well, so could we use the sand to create a lattice that's as complex as nature? Like, you can see the palm tree there. Like, I'm always very humbled by natural things, because when you see these relationships in nature, they're so incredibly more complex than what we could think of. And that's also why I love Chris, because when he puts like in his renders, he put natural things. You don't know what's more beautiful, the natural things or the actual objects we create. And I think, like, it's if anything, our projects celebrate that. It celebrates that we should be humble in face of nature, and we should kind of learn from it and not think that what we do is in any way superior to it, because then we're doomed. Nature is always telling us, hey, dude, you think you're superior, and then boom, coronavirus in your face. Yeah, what do you think of that?
Yeah.
Sorry.
And actually yesterday I just came about an article from the Jenny Sabin. She is the Cornell Department of Architecture's director. So she said in a good way that about the materials, because like you are mentioning the bioplastic, sand, now the much respectful materials. So she said that I think it's an architect's responsibility to step in the same way that architects were stepping in after the 1980s flu epidemic, when they became obsessed with light and air. And now we need to be obsessed with something else, and it will be materials, supply chain, and access. So it's really true that to think about, it's not only the design, it's not only the kind of production, the final production. It's only the process, the fabrication, the materials, the supply chain, as you say, the circular economy. So I believe that there are a lot of things coming our minds nowadays.
Yeah, there is life cycle, there is where things come from, where they go. That was a big conversation around the piece we did for COS. Most of the projects we work on are not about the project necessarily. They're actually about the topics they start and what they address. And because, I'm a teacher, so in a way I teach through the architecture. And so there's this, but there's also the acceptance of a new kind of space, which is the virtual world. And to me, that's my biggest lesson. I don't think it's necessarily just life cycle. I think life cycle is crucial, and we're going to get better softwares to calculate the difference between different materials. And we're going to have, LCA analysis. That's a real science. And I really encourage people to look into the life cycle analysis science, because there's different ways to assess people, assess materials, not just people. But also we're going to have to think of things like traveling, because there's no point in getting bioplastic if it comes all the way from Indonesia and you have to ship it. Like when you see the efficiency of traveling, it's crazy. I think like a car uses about 30% of its mass for fuel, but when you think of planes, I think they use 80% of their mass. And I think the Galaxia, although we burn it, which is kind of crazy, and people are going to be like, oh, well, actually, I think this was only like 4 tons of carbon when you think of the offset of the wood. But when you think of flying there, it's already 4 tons. So me flying there is already as much as burning the project. Like, I think it's such a complex science that unless architects start to learn it, we're going to be doomed to superficial impressions. We're going to be doomed to be just repeating what material suppliers tell us. And I think it's not very cool. So we need to make it cool somehow, but I think we need to really get serious about that. There's no simple theory. There's no simple ism. It's going to be just sheer numbers and stats. And I think I encourage people to look at the stats. There's a book called, I think, How Much Does a Banana Pollute or something? And it gives you all the stats about all kinds of materials and stuff. So and then the virtual world, obviously, will make us travel less. I think that's for sure.
Yeah, sure. And also you mentioned that you're a kind of a lecturer in the Westminster University. So how it also works going in a virtual way, because I know that the studio culture is very important for an architecture student as a maker. So how would you continue the production in these issues?
It's very hard. I mean, it's very hard for the students because I think they're not necessarily used to that. I set up a business. I was on my own. I had to go through this period of self-discipline, right? Like to kind of wake up, put yourself in front of a computer, get to work. That's when you're an entrepreneur, you have to do that. Like there's no choice. And so I really try and give them like this feeling that this project is theirs. I think nothing can be worse if you're passive, if you're waiting for a teacher to tell you the solution, you're waiting for a client to tell you what to do. The best solution is sort of being self-driven, is to be aware that what you do is yours, and that what you do, you can change, you can have an impact outside, and that really people are excited to see what you have to offer to the world. And I hope people can feel this way. They can feel that, if anything, what they can learn from this is that they can do things. They can kind of come up with something new and sort of say to the world, I've got this thing, and then the world will reply. And if in the world it doesn't reply, then change and propose something else, and change and pivot. And I think the entrepreneurial world does this well, but somehow we separate architecture from the entrepreneurial world.
Yeah,
which is a shame.
As I told you, sometimes, especially architecture students, thinks that there are two ways and they are going to select one of the ways, that they are going to be kind of entrepreneurial. They are taking risks and doing something different. And the other way is they're going to the big offices and working as a really, no. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a shame. I was lucky to be, with the Burning Man community. So, it makes us closer to the entrepreneurial world. I was lucky to speak to people like Sergey Brin from Google and so on. So I was always like seeing how excited they are about architecture. I remember something funny where Sergey Brin sent me an email and said, Arthur, I'm so sorry to bug you, but I'm building this playground for my son, and I want to know how you connect wood. And he was so excited. And we're like, it's funny because we think architecture is this weird thing, and I think that's because it's been bubbled up into something very separate from the rest of the world. And because we've lost that connection, we don't realize how excited people are about architecture. And a lot of people want to become architects. And you'd be surprised how even the tech world that we see as a very remote thing from us is excited about our profession. We need to be excited about it. We need to connect to the general public because we've lost a little bit. We just make it a little bit more complex than needed. And so yeah, I just encourage you to be aware of the impact you can have and read entrepreneurial books, really. Yeah.
I think it's a good advice because they sometimes thinking about it's hard to select this entrepreneur way. Also, I would like to ask about the COS project because we know that COS is a fashion brand and they are really looking towards the art, design, and architecture. They are really cool about it. But when I saw your 3D printed installation, I think also the people behind the installation is a very inspiring for me. They're really touching and understanding what's going on here. So how this collaboration came about and what are you feeling about this collaboration in the Milan? Maybe also I will show the images as well.
Well, so I was in the desert, obviously building Galaxia, and then one of my colleagues, Bilal, he received a phone call in the office, and then it's like, hi, it's COS. Could we speak to Arthur? We have a project, and then he's like, well, he's kind of busy, and then he's really good. I love Bilal because he can talk anyone into a long-term friendship. And so he was just like, oh, all right, tell me about it. Tell me the project. And so slowly they started kind of realizing we were concluding this amazing project. So they were very patient. And then they asked to come and they said, well, can you come and see us to present your work? And we might be working together. And they sent me a really, really clear brief, clear budget. I think for any clients out there, if you want a good project, make a good brief and make a clear brief and something that where you say your values, because really as architect, we're here to help clients express their values. And so I realized very quickly that I would have to explain what we stand for to see if that's aligned with them. And, they're owned by H&M. And at the time I was, obviously very concerned about, our problems with carbon footprint and so on and plastics. And so I went to them and I said, oh, well, what do you think of fast fashion? What is the issue? What can we address? How can we change things? And instead of telling, oh, this guy is too much trouble, it was more like, oh, great, we can address this together through that piece, And so I brought one of the tiers from Galaxia. I was just coming to the office and I said, well, this is made of sugar and it's fermented sugar. And, we spin it into becoming plastic, and then you can add all kinds of additives like wood, algae, whatever. You can add whatever you want in there to color it, so you have natural pigments and so on. And they got really interested in this idea. And then I explained what parametric design is. Now that's the biggest challenge I think for anyone, to explain parametric design to the general public. And I said to them, well, it's like when you walk in the forest and you pick up a flower, and you're like, whoa, so interesting how this geometry seems organized, but actually it's the result of many, many small things that interact with many different parameters, the sun, the structure, well, that's parametric design. And so I said, well, in this case, we have to use as little amount of material as we can. We have to somehow relate to the site. We have to have a module that's the size of our printer because we cannot print bigger than that. And so here you go, that's all our parameters. So we have to play with this, and we have to take that constraint and make a project from these constraints. And it's funny because often people think, oh, he's an architect, I'm going to give him carte blanche, and then he's going to come up with some crazy ideas. And I said, well, I don't want that. Like, here's my parameters. Like, can we do something about that? And so I think that it was really collaborative. And then we're like, okay, well, we need a specific type of printer. And, I'm very lucky to work with WASP, who's they're amazing Italian company that believes in 3D printing with Earth, new villages, and they're Buddhist, and they want to, they have this whole thing about Shambhala and like this ideal city, amazing people. And so they have this 3D printer that's 3 meters high called the WASP 3MT. And they have a community of people. So I connected with the ones that were in Milan, in Venice, just around the site. And we started to work together on that. And everyone produced about 200 modules. And then we brought them together, and then we installed them in Milan together. So, and then by the end of the event, we thought we would be composting the whole thing. And then all the employees of COS said, I want one, I want one. And so everyone took one of the bricks, and now they're in people's gardens, and people are growing tomatoes on them or something.
But it's amazing. It looks like
yeah, it was a really nice project. Like, for example, you see on the left with the tree, that's a present, because this building is really interesting. It was where Mussolini had his headquarters during the war. And it's also now the city of Milan's city hall council. And this was a present from the Japanese ambassador. And at first we weren't meant to build there. We were meant to build inside a lot of stuff, like from the courtyard to the garden and inside. And then we realized that PLA is way too, it doesn't match the fire requirements. So we had to build outside. And because it's modular, it was really fairly simple to actually switch to an outdoor situation. And then suddenly, because we had trees, we had to avoid that tree. And so it was nice to be open-minded and open-ended in the architecture and have a bottom-up system, because we could adapt to many scenarios. But now the challenge is to find a fireproof PLA. Because I don't want to produce anymore. Yeah. If anyone out there knows one, fireproof PLA,
please write.
Yeah.
And also today within the architecture, we always talking about digital tools, from machine learning to fabrication technologies, as you already mentioned, and from sometimes artificial intelligence to the big data. So they are becoming more and more, how can I say, pervasive and quickly. How digital fabrication is transforming what it means to be an architect. We already talked about this.
Yeah. I think there is the really, really advanced thing that's going on, obviously. And then there is the really democratic things that are happening, like how, I don't know that it's as much the invention and the patenting of 3D printing that excited me, but actually it is the kind of democratic value. The fact that so many people could have it. I'm less interested in crazy robots that create crazy shape, but more the moment that it actually has an impact on reality. So in my mind, our FabPub and using, open source system, we wrote this thing with a friend of mine called Adam Holloway. We wrote a silkworm for a grasshopper. I was so excited when, we realized that G-code was so simple, and that G-code is the code you send to 3D printers. And it's the same that you send to CNC machine, it's the same. And it's really just simple text. And that means you just have to have concatenate text together, which is just X, Y, Z, and then E value and so on. And so I think when I saw this, I was like, wow, that's just so amazing how we're often told that things are so complex because it serves, higher purposes like commercial purposes and so on. So it's not always in everyone's interest to be transparent about how simple something can be. But as a teacher, for me, it was always about teaching. So I have to simplify concept, but sometimes they are so simple that my only role is to show how simple something is. And so I hope this will happen with things like machine learning and artificial intelligence, because we're often told, oh, machines are going to take over and so on. And then I look at the code and the stuff and I'm like, oh my, this is just really not as crazy as we say it is. And it's not going to take over the world because the machine just cannot do what we think it can do. And so I really hope that, as we learn this thing, we also explain them in ways that are empowering people to learn it and to see how the potential is to save the world, rather than how it's going to just, you know, take over the world or replace us or create forms that are, you know, only for the happy few that, you know, can use this technology and make fancy things and brag about it. Like, I just hope we see it the other way around, as an empowerment.
And actually, what do you think about now, maybe related to this COVID pandemic as well? How do you think our skills will change in a kind of that we can cling on a sake of sustainability, this community issues, as you mentioned? What's your, like, there is a kind of a spin-off arising from this COVID-19?
Well, I mean, number one, I think it's going to change our relationship to our home and to our parks and to nature and to the air. On a very simple basic, because like I had symptoms and I couldn't really breathe, and you realize like, oh my God, like nothing matters more than air, really. and then you go outside in the park and it smells so good because there's no cars, and it's like, wow, that's how a city could be. And it's so quiet, and so you can hear the birds, and because there is less ozone pollution, then you can feel the sun, and you can feel. And I'm very much a city guy. I was born in Paris, then I lived in London. Like I don't know nature as well as people like, you know, Chris Fresh in the mountains. So when I feel the sun, then I hear the birds, I'm like, ah, you know. And so I think we're going to kind of rethink our relationship to that, because I think a lot of people went through what I went through. And so we're going to understand the importance of nature. The other thing I think is when we started doing the masks for the NHS, you know, we realized the power of having machines. And you know, I think people will start like decentralizing a bit more this concept that we have to wait for things to be fabricated, like in China, or also just like, you know, growing food. Like we could grow food here. We can make our own plastic. We can make our own furniture. We can make our own. Why do we rely on other companies? Why don't we rely on other machines? Why is our economy so kind of like held by things and not distributed to all of us? And I really hope that we'll realize that we can have a sort of self-reliance, a sort of radical self-reliance in that sense. I hope so. I'll continue to do things towards that.
And also, as a kind of, as you already mentioned, I also traveled a lot to Turkey, like a lot of reasons that's coming up, like conferences, live like talks and other things. But nowadays, I kind of very much food, really. It's a kind of, it's not only a talk, it's a real thing. So what's your opinion about traveling in coming days? Like maybe your priorities? And
I mean, I love traveling. Obviously, who doesn't, right? Like, you know, it's so amazing to go somewhere, but we have to understand that although EasyJet is very cheap, the value, the actual environmental value of flying is crazy. And I really hope that one day this carbon tax comes into action, because we'll then understand the preciousness of traveling. And we wouldn't just kind of casually take a weekend somewhere, and we'd understand how precious that is. So I hope that we'll actually kind of travel less or travel in a different way. One is the machines themselves, the planes. You know, I don't understand why kind of helium aircrafts are not taking over. Like, I don't understand why we're not thinking of alternative ways of traveling that are way less, you know, like you saw the difference between a train and a car and a plane and a spaceship. Like people that talk about spaceship, like a spaceship is about, like, I don't know, 90% of its mass is fuel. It's when a spaceship flies, I can tell you how much like carbon compared to something else. It's crazy. So to think spaceships will take over, it is mad, unless we rethink them. And so if the kind of duration of a trip is not a problem, if we're okay with that, then I think things like helium or more tunnels, like the channel tunnels, or, you know, bridges, or, I mean, it's for us as architects and engineers and designers to rethink the world. Like it's up to us. It's up to us to allow people to travel. Like we're in charge of the physical world, you know? Yeah. So we need to see the stats, and we need to understand what can be done. But I don't think traveling by plane has a future.
Yeah, I think it's a point of view that what you are going to select and prioritize your, how can I say, your travels and your wish about the life as well. So also I'm wondering that I know that you love Istanbul and you want to see Cappadocia in Turkey, maybe you will go someday.
Yeah. I mean, I went to Istanbul. I used to be with someone who was Turkish, and I love it. I mean, there's this author called Pierre Loti who wrote Aziyad, which is a beautiful book about, how he lived there and how he was completely amazed by the magic of it, and even things like, the architecture and the innovations that happened like within the Ottoman Empire, like things like that I tell my students a lot is the sort of understanding how buildings can heal. For example, there were kind of buildings in which people that had mental issues would go, and there was the water in the middle, the fountain, and the water would create sound that would create a sort of peace for the mind, and that would heal. Mental issues, and things like this. Like, I just love learning about things like this, and there is this this amazing kind of crossroad in Istanbul, between so many cultures, and it's such an open, secular version of what a sort of Middle East, a kind of country can be. So I'm fascinated by that place.
I really miss, especially the Bosphorus. So nowadays,
I'll be back at some point.
And finally, I have we are now, I think, running out of time. But do you have any tips or suggestions that for all of us to listeners that you are doing good at home, like listening podcasts, or what's your suggestions for the other architects or designers?
I think beware of universal rules. Beware of thinking that we know things. Like, be humble. I think we don't know much. Like, obviously, you see the COVID. Like, we still haven't had a solution, a vaccine, or anything. We can only rely on science. But to be honest, like, very often architects think they have solutions. And write manifestos and like and I worry about this. I think that if anything, we should be a very humble profession, because design is a big word. Design feels like we know what we're doing, but walk around and look at a leaf. Look at a tree and see how complex that is, right? And learn from it. Like, be aware that we're very far from reaching that sort of perfection. And so that's my advice. Try to learn from things around you, and know that anything can be an inspiration. Be open-minded, and don't put breaks or categories around things. Then you'll be you'll be very happy, because you'll realize that any conversation, any things you're seeing, any book you're reading can be inspiration. That's what I learned here in London at the AA when I studied here. And, I feel lucky in that sense, that I wasn't constrained by a certain dogma or certain professors. And if anything, they told me, learn from anything. Yeah.
I think it's important for us to both cope with what's happening, but as well as you said, focus on the nature, the environment, and continue to produce about what you are doing best. So Arthur, thank you so much for your time. It's been
thank you.
Inspiring talk. Yeah. And see you in a FabPub, maybe.
Yeah.
And see you everyone in Turkey and London, whatever you are listening us, and have a beautiful weekend. Thank you.
Cool.
Thank you. Bye.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, now I ended now, I believe.